All right, let's get into the story. Now, when I went to Greenville, North Carolina to take care of my grandfather, I was staying in a house that in a house that he and his wife, ex-wife, or estranged wife at the time had. And the estranged wife, although they were separated, she would still come to the house periodically and get clothes. She didn't move everything out, so she would come and get clothes, get personal belongings, store things there, and so on and so forth. So when I had come and began doing my part in terms of helping to take care of my terminally ill grandfather, his wife would come. She had a key, so there was no letting her in. She had a key, and you never knew when she would show up. So my first week there, she got word that one of his grandchildren would be coming down to take care of him. And she came through to say hello and to get some belongings. And before she left, she said to me the following: "I'm so glad you're here to help take care of your grandfather, but let me make you aware of a couple of things. Number one, if you see the spirit of," she mentioned the guy's name, I can't remember his name. The guy was someone she went to church with, and they were really close. She mentioned his name. She said, "There's a spirit of this guy. He comes around. He's been coming around since he passed on. He don't mean no harm, so don't be afraid." Number one. Now, in my previous video, I mentioned that I was picking up the presence of the spirit and energy, and I always felt like someone was standing near me or watching me. And the funny thing about it is that some of my other cousins who came to visit, they would say the same thing. They were kind of creeped out by the environment, but I was picking it up the strongest because naturally I was a highly I am, and was even then, even though I wasn't quite tapped in as strongly as I am now, highly empathic and could see and pick up things that weren't so obvious to everyone else. And this was what aided in my inability to properly sleep. But when I got to sleep, I was pretty good, generally speaking. So she said that. So that was validation to what I had stated in the previous video about picking up on a spirit and a presence there. She confirmed it. I never said anything to anyone else. My cousins and I, we talked about it after the fact. Then she also said that she has a friend. This guy was always with her. He was a really big, tall, very menacing, intimidating looking guy. She would call him her friend. Okay? I'm older looking back. I took her at face value back then, but older looking back. Yeah, there's more to that. But he would always come with her when she would come to the house. She also told me that he would come by every now and then and look in on us. And the way he would do it, he would be peering and looking in the window. And again, I always felt like there was always something or someone watching. It was just a very strongly uneasy energy that I was picking up on. So that didn't help make this experience any better. So I wanted to share that because that ties into, again, some points that I made in the very first video. Now, let me tell you guys something else. When my mother found out that my grandfather her father was terminally ill, what she wanted to do was find their younger brother, whose name is John Roberts. Again, all of this is part 2 to part 1. John Robert ran away from home at the age of 17 because he and my grandfather, they just didn't get along. So my mother really wanted to find him. So what my mother did was she hired a private investigator to find John Robert. And my mother paid a pretty penny. Now when she paid for the investigator, this was about a year or more before I had actually moved down south to help take care of my grandfather. So there was a lot that went into that I wasn't directly involved with, but I do remember my mother getting calls, and she would appear to get a lead, and then it would end up being a brick wall, and then there'll be another lead, and then there'll be something else. It was like a false lead. So this went on for, I would say, about 8-9 months. And the private investigator that she hired basically couldn't find anything. So my mother basically gave up the search, mostly because she ran out of the money. Now I'm looking back, I can see some things with that particular investigator who was basically milking the situation, if you read in between the lines. So my mother ran out of the money to keep that particular investigator, or any investigator for that matter, on the case. So my mother eventually just gave it up. She just gave it up and let it be. After my grandfather passed, I would say years down the road, my mother met this guy, and they were dating, and they were basically boyfriend and girlfriend, and they dated for a while. So my mother would mention to her boyfriend at that time that she had a younger brother, and she always wanted to find him, and wanted to find him before her father had passed, but no luck. So it turns out that her boyfriend was either related to someone who was a really good investigator, or he knew someone who was connected to the family who was a really good investigator. Right off the top of my dome, I don't remember, but he had offered to help my mother find her brother. My mother's boyfriend was from Pennsylvania. This is very interesting. The connection he had with the investigator was also tied in Pennsylvania as well. And this, again, listen closely, y'all. This is a very bittersweet, full circle moment. So right off the bat, my mother and her boyfriend, they went to Pennsylvania to meet with this investigator. And my mother brought every possible lead she could give him, what she had, to whatever she had, right? And she wanted to meet with him. And again, this was also a trip for her and her boyfriend as well, because this is his hometown. So long story short, there was a lead. Then there was another lead. Then there was another lead. And the lead turns out that they found a lead to John Robert in Pennsylvania. Okay? Now, what are the odds of that? So they decided to make another trip to go to Pennsylvania because the investigator wanted to meet with them directly to share with them what they had found. They did find John Roberts. They had found where he lived. And it turns out that John Roberts was also trying to find his family as well. But because they all moved from that location. Now, keep in mind, this was way, way back. They didn't have cell phones and the internet and all the sophisticated ways in which we can find people now. So because everybody moved from the South, the home that John Robert knew, they found him where he lived. His wife was no longer living. They found John Robert was murdered. And He was murdered in 1985. He was murdered by his ex-wife. It turns out there was a lot of domesticated type violence going on. The investigation led to this, but my mother really got the real nuts and bolts from the mother-in-law, who was the mother of John Roberts' wife. So she met with my mother and her boyfriend, and she explained all of this. She said that there was domestic violence in the situation. The mother said that he always talked about his family. He wanted to find his family. He tried everything he could to find the family, could never find them. The day that he was murdered, his wife basically snapped and stabbed him to death. And keep in mind, John Robert, at that time, even if he was living at that time when my mother found him, he would have been no more than about 40. My mother was like, I would say my mother was like 46, 48, 49, somewhere around there. He would still be a young man. So the family was pretty optimistic that there was a good chance we could find him and he'd be alive, because he was still a relatively young man. But yes, the wife had stabbed him to death. There was a temporary insanity type plea deal. She didn't do any time because there was a history of domestic violence. You know, the cops going and, breaking the situation up, or what have you. But again, his wife ended up passing away. The only thing my mother was able to get from the mother-in-law was his driver's license. And I remember my mother brought the driver's license back, and I remember looking at that picture of my uncle, who I had never seen or never met, and I could see in his eyes, you could tell he was also a heavy drinker. He was an alcoholic. He was very troubled, obviously. His eyes were like bloodshot red. I saw all the pain and the hurt in his eyes. He looked so depressed, sad, hurt, like life had just beaten him down. He didn't age well, but he looked exactly like my uncle and my grandfather. So here, this part ties into what my grandfather, remember the part when I mentioned that my grandfather, when he came out of the first surgery, before he said his last goodbye, my last time seeing him alive, he was talking about he saw his son, John Robert. He couldn't tell you where he was, but he had seen him. You see how that full circle moment came about? Nobody knew that he was dead, because by the time we buried our grandfather, he was already dead. He was already gone. So for my grandfather, and no one knowing that he was gone by that time, that was a powerful full circle moment. So think about that. So, and then for my mother to meet a boyfriend who just so happened to be from the same place that he ended up moving and ended up, being murdered. That was definitely divine guidance and divine intervention. And I like to say that I feel like my grandfather's spirit was all in that whole thing, because once we go over on the other side of the veil, we see everything. There are no secrets. There really aren't any secrets. And so from that perspective, they see everything we do. And I'm sure my grandfather really appreciated knowing that my mother wanted to do that for him and help to make that a reality. No one is going to tell me that was just some accident, some random thing. That was a powerful, divinely orchestrated, full circle moment. Now that's it to part 2. I will talk about part 3 when I saw my grandfather on the astral plane. And I'm also going to do a video about my uncle, because I'm now realizing that my grandfather, that experience I had with my grandfather and my uncle, who is the oldest son or girl of my mother and sister, he became the patriarch of the family after my grandfather left, and after my uncle passed, my mother ended up becoming the matriarch of the family. So I see where these two very strong, very warrior, powerful men didn't take mess from nobody, how they played very powerful catalysts in my purpose. And this is why I am speaking about them and talking about them at this time. So that's the end of that one. Look out for the next video. And I thank you so very much for sharing this moment with me. You got any comments or anything you would like to suggest that I talk about or share, leave it down at the bottom of this video. And also thank you to everybody who has donated in support of this unique ministry, my music, my website, my videos. I thank you all so much for the support. All right, that's it. You are loved beyond measure. Continue to question, learn, and grow, and happy travels.